Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 4, Episode 13, the Baker's Dozen episode. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In this episode, we are back on the mic together at different parts of the country. Steve, it was great to see you in Vegas, and we are taking the opportunity to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the release of your best-selling book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, with our very special guest, Sucharita Kodali, VP, Principal Analyst, great friend to the industry and to us, been on the podcast from Forrester Research, who wrote the foreword to the second edition.
It's always great to have Sucharita on. She's got such great perspective, and she's very kind to write the foreword. So looking forward to that conversation.
And I'm very happy that I got the title of your book correct this time, because for many, many months, I did not. I often would say in the age of digital disruption, and you would keep correcting me, but it's some kind of reflex of mine. I wanted to rename your book. So I thought I'd throw that out in case you're, in case you're toying with a renaming of the book. I seem to have come up with it randomly anyway.
Well, there is, to be fair, there is a lot of digital disruption, but, I think maybe it had to do with like spacing on the cover or something really profound.
That sideways writing got me every time. All right, so we'll get to our interview with Sucharita, but first the news of the week. So JC Penney, so Mark Rosen, who came out of an organization I worked for, Levi's, is now at JC Penney, and he seems to have a new plan.
Yeah, their new plan is to love the customers that love them.
Wait, stop. What?
Well, so the messaging on this is really interesting. I mean, basically what he's saying is we don't need no stinking new customers. We are going to focus on winning and growing with the customers we already have. I would say he's gotten a lot of pushback generally on that, because I think it is pretty clear that JC Penney needs new customers, because pretty much any brand needs new customers. So I think the messaging of it was not great. Whether they're really going to, just focus on existing customers, I think remains to be seen how this is going to play out. Now, what that actually means, right, is, if somebody who's ever bought from us in the last few years, an existing customer, but they've only shopped once, there's a lot. I'm sure Penny's has quite a large number of folks in their database. Yeah, so on the one hand, if you've already got some semblance of relationship with them, you've got their email address, whatever, it makes a certain amount of sense. But I think, Penny's challenges are much bigger than simply how their customer strategy plays out. They've got some really fundamental issues of being overinvested in real estate that's losing relevance. They're a classic example of a brand that is stuck in the boring middle. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I certainly don't think this gives me any confidence that Penny's is going to somehow mount a real turnaround, but we'll see how this plays out. They've got a new ad campaign and a bunch of other things, but the devil, of course, is in the details on a lot of these things. But they've got a major uphill battle, in my opinion.
Well, your comments made me laugh out loud, as the kids would say. Thoughts and prayers, basically. They got a lot of hurdles to overcome. And Mark Rosen did a nice job at Levi's in helping their digital, and I speak from a bit of experience having launched their digital e-commerce. But it's a very different transition from a wholesale brand. Yeah, okay, he's got some stores, to running JC Penney. That's a very interesting. It's a very interesting choice, and we wish him well, of course.
Yeah, I don't know, Mark. I think there's probably like a when good people get bad jobs sort of. I just think some of these companies are so disadvantaged, and of course, I way back when I worked at Sears, we spent a lot of time focused on JC Penney, and really JC Penney's done very little to improve their business over the last 20 years. So they're really playing from behind. And have a lot of uphill battle. And the bottom line, which, I often say, which is a real challenge, is that people don't switch brands for a slightly better version of mediocre. They've got to win, in a category that is basically contracting, has been contracting for 2 decades. For them to be successful, they have to win a lot of business away from pretty good competition. So aside from the customer focus, what are those things from a product customer experience standpoint that are going to be powerful enough, remarkable enough to win a lot of business away? And I just don't see it. So, but yeah, best of luck, thoughts and prayers. We'll see how this goes.
He's not the first executive to go into JC Penney with the hopes of reviving it. So as we said, best of luck. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Shein. So valued at $100 billion. I put on my best Dr. Evil voice there for the $1 billion and for other reasons. Now, I was reading the article. Bigger sales than H&M, Zara, and Forever 21. Well, the last one's not hard, but it's an incredible story, and it is really a story of cheap versus sustainable and where that product's coming from. And our friend Jason Goldberg was arguing that, in fact, the way they make it, it's better than some of the other fast fashion to the environment. It's a complex story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really innovative business model. Shein's come out of, pretty much out of nowhere to this incredible hyper growth company in just a few years, and gotten this incredible valuation. Folks don't know they have this model where they basically follow innovative designs, largely coming out of influencers, and then they just make a few of these products, turn them around in just, I think, a matter of hours and days in many cases, and then they put it up on the site, and if it does well, they make a bunch more. So, to Jason's point, I think it's more sustainable from the standpoint that they're not likely to get stuck with a lot of inventory, which ultimately
has been an H&M issue. H&M has got billions of dollars of stuff that just winds up.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much a worldwide issue for the apparel business that a lot of stuff ultimately doesn't get sold and ends up in a landfill. So from that perspective, it seems to reduce the waste. On the other hand, because it's sort of the cheap and cheerful product, it's probably and because their customer base is largely teens who, some of their customers are growing, right? They're going to outgrow or outlove the fashion of it. And so that's, I think the claim or the challenge for a lot of fast fashion players is that a lot of stuff ends up having to be resold or thrown away. So it's not clear to me what the overall sustainability impact is likely to be. But I think this is a great example where, you say younger people, whether you're talking about Gen Z, Gen X, whatever, are so interested in purpose-driven brands. And yet here's a brand that I don't think really can make the argument that they're a strongly purpose-driven brand because, ultimately a lot of people can't afford or just, prefer certain kinds of brands, and they make the trade-off between price and what's good for the environment or good for sort of a broader social impact.
All right. This next story feels, how shall I say, far-fetched to me. I read the headlines and I had to double click on it. Farfetched invests $200 million in Neiman Marcus Group to run their something or rather. What's going on here?
Well, I actually think this is pretty interesting. When I saw the headline, I was kind of, like a dog tilting its head. But I actually think, as I understand it anyway, so Farfetched, they're investing $200 million in the Neiman Marcus Group, but it's really the partnership that they're going to forge, which I think is interesting. So as I understand it, Farfetched is going to basically help Neiman Marcus Group create more of a global marketplace. So as we know, a lot of retailers are trying to extend their assortment, extend their reach by standing up some sort of marketplace. And so I think that is what Neiman Marcus gets out of this also, because Farfetched is much stronger outside of North America. I think it has the opportunity for Neiman Marcus and Bergdorf Goodman, their other brand, to get more of a global presence. And so I think for Farfetched, it's, they're getting also more of a play into the U.S. market where they're not as strong. So I think in terms of possible mutual benefits, it's pretty strong. I mean, I do think it was curious that they also took an equity position in Neiman Marcus. And I don't know if that was just Neiman's saying, hey, if you want to play with us, that's the cost of doing business, because we could use the cash to invest in upping our technical skills and other things they're trying to do. So it's an interesting structure.
Or we could just use the cash because,
Right. And it's hard to say because Neiman Marcus is a private company now, but $200 million probably only gets Farfetched, 3 or 4% of the company. So it's not like it's a big factor in terms of determining their their future destiny. So, and, potentially, it's always interesting, I think, to say if you forge a partnership with, whatever the terms of the deal would be from a just operational standpoint, that you also participate in the company's upside if things do well. So from Farfetch's standpoint, they get to participate in the growth of Neiman Marcus's equity and presumably a future IPO.
Couple of last things. Let's just round up with. I noticed in the news, and it caught my attention for a whole bunch of reasons. Walmart offering, it was at $110,000. They've got a real shortage of truck drivers, and this whole shortage of truck driver thing has been on my mind for a long time. And listen, I think we don't have a shortage of truck drivers. We have a shortage of the right compensation to attract people to what is a tough job. And so, I keep turning that script around. And you pay people enough money, they'll take that job. But you got to pay them enough money because it's not a great job some days, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of what COVID has taught us about employment is that some of these, more difficult jobs, whether we're talking about truck driving, which I agree. I watched this, I mentioned to you off mic that John Oliver did a episode on his show on HBO, which maybe we'll link in the show notes about this. And it really gives me an expanded perspective on just how difficult the job is and just some of the conditions that really drive how truck drivers get paid. But, we're seeing this across a spectrum of jobs, not just in retail, where people are moving to places that not only pay more, but in many cases provide a better quality of life, whether that's just how they're treated or a schedule or, whatever it might be. And so when the labor market is this tight, this is just a natural thing that's going to happen. So in some ways, I think, I'm not necessarily talking specifically to what Walmart is doing, but just I think in general, this is actually shining a light on working conditions in places where you could argue people have been systematically underpaid. So I know it's very tough on the companies that are dealing with rising costs and in some cases inability to execute the way they want to. But, obviously that can also have impact on the consumer. They can't get their products when they want, or the prices are going to be higher. So, it's a broader issue, but at the same time, I almost feel like this is a correction of something that maybe is long overdue. But that's our different podcast on the politics of labor.
Well, all right, let's leave it there. Now let's get to our wonderful interview with Sucharita Kodali. So great to have her back on the mic. She's been a guest before. So without further ado, well, this is exciting. We're marking the first anniversary, or the second anniversary, I guess, the first anniversary of the second edition and second anniversary of the first edition.
It's very confusing.
Of the launch of what I long considered, not that I'm biased, but even setting all that bias aside, one of the best books I've ever read of strategy and retail, remarkable retail. So thank you, Sucharita, for joining us. We're celebrating. Steve is here as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Michael and Steve.
Do you have any cake or anything to celebrate? I think, is that?
Yeah, or champagne. I'm feeling like I'm a little, I'm being gypped here.
Yeah. Well, next time we see you in person, that is on the table. We're all getting a round of champagne. And I know Steve expressed to me how appreciative he was of you participating and writing the opening notes. So we wanted to get you back on at this anniversary and just chit and chat about the current state of affairs and a bunch of stuff. And let me ping back to you, Steve. Let's talk about, for those who have read the book, maybe haven't heard, you chat about it. We've talked about it in the podcast. You had a launch, but talk about why you wrote a second edition that released this time last year. What compelled you to put fingers to keys again and take another run at it and update the first edition?
Well, in some respects, I think the motivation was the same. I wanted to put something out in the world that would hopefully make a little bit of a dent in the universe around trying to get retailers to think a bit differently about their strategy. So that was really the motivation for the second edition. The thing that really prompted it, of course, was COVID. And as we know by now, COVID accelerated an awful lot of trends. So while the core of the advice, I think, is fundamentally the same, I felt like I had to kind of reset the starting point since so much had happened in such a short period of time. So it was a little bit different point of departure, but really fundamentally the same motivation.
Right on. And Sucharita, you were, as I said, kind enough to write the foreword for Remarkable Retail second edition. What message were you trying to convey? And, it had been now, 18 months since you put fingers to keys to write it up. Would you frame it any differently, reflecting on what's happened or what you were thinking at the time?
Well, first, it was a great honor to get a chance to write it. So thank you, Steve, for asking me to do that. In terms of that intro, that forward, it was. A lot of it was really about some of the macro changes that I think had even preceded COVID. A lot of it was about the growth of a certain company in Seattle and another company in Arkansas that continue to really, kind of have some of the biggest investments in retail and are continuing to shape and define a lot of shopper expectations. And that's a lot of what Steve addresses is in that world where things are changing. How do you survive and how do you thrive? So I don't think that much has changed. What one thing I will say though, which is very pertinent to now, is that I made a reference to like a political science book called The End of History, which was about the end of the Cold War. And if anything, now I think it's kind of crazy how we're almost going for full circle and nothing is ever as it seems seemingly in history. And I think that applies whether it's political science or retail or any type of business, which is that you may think that, all right, it's over. Like this is the new playbook and things change again.
Well, we'll get into that a bit later because I'm very curious to get your thoughts on this sentiment, both of you actually, the sentiment that the period of globalization that we just had for the past 20, 30 years, particularly after Glasnost and the walls came down, is kind of over, that we're in a new phase, a less positive phase. But let's get back to that. Steve, I wanted to check in, when you started thinking, take the listeners back to when you started thinking about writing a book. What were you hoping to achieve, and do you think you've got there?
Well, worldwide fame, of course, was my primary objective.
Check, tick, you done it. All right. End podcast interview.
So now, I can retire. No, I mean, at one level, I was really hoping to get, I would say mostly large retailers to really, fundamentally accelerate their change. And, we've talked about it a bunch of times on the podcast. Why does it take a crisis for retailers to innovate? And, that's certainly what we observed, I think, through the pandemic crisis, that a lot of retailers that were very slow to change suddenly managed to get a bunch of things done in a very short period of time. So that was good at one level, but I still think that there isn't nearly the degree of change that needs to happen to be successful in the future. So to the extent I could motivate some retailers to take a different path, that was what I was hoping for. Now, I think it's fair to say that my book has not changed the entire industry overnight or anything like that. But in a couple cases where I've interacted with retailers that are adopting some of the principles in my book, it's fun to see that happen. The other part is that, as a consultant and as a speaker and as a writer, you only reach so many people, so many organizations. So one of the advantages of a book is, it could be I always say like a florist in Wichita, Kansas, or some other smaller business that's never going to be able to maybe get to a conference to hear me or Sucharita talk or, hire us as consultants, that there's a way to kind of put a bunch of advice in a digestible form that can make a difference. And it's been really, really gratifying to get feedback from small businesses that they feel like it's made a difference. In fact, you and I were just at Shop Talk, and we had several people come up to us and talk both about the book and the podcast and how it's affected them. So just, you're not going to make any money from this type of book. So it's not about the money. It's really about hopefully seeing change happen. But obviously, I'd love to get the message out there even on a wider basis.
Now, Remarkable Retail, and I said this off the top, in my mind, and I think in yours as well, is really a strategy book. It's certainly not a book about predictions, but there are things that you, I guess, would say predicted or thought that they would turn one way or another. Is there anything that you feel you really nailed, you got right, and others maybe that didn't pan out exactly the way that you thought might? I guess we could frame this around our six forces of the COVID economy. But is there anything that comes to mind when you 1 year later from the second edition reflect back?
Yeah, well, it is 1 year as the edition came out, but as you alluded to with Sucharita, you have to finish writing the book pretty much about 5 months before it actually comes out, so it's a little bit longer. But I think I've made a big deal about the retail apocalypse being nonsense, and I think by the time I first really started talking about that, both in the first edition and the second edition, I think it's become pretty clear that physical retail is far from dead. I've also been challenging whether so many of these digitally native vertical brands are actually going to turn out to be successful. So I kind of went out on a limb on that. And I think if we look at what's happened the last few months anyway, I think that's becoming more clear that whole area is not quite as easy or maybe not quite as big and profitable as people hoped. As it relates to some of the specific things I said about the impact of COVID, I feel really pretty good about everything I said. I think the one thing that has really surprised me, as I sent the book off to the printers in the early part of last year, I really thought 2021 would be a much tougher year for retail. Not that certain retailers, like the so-called essential retailers, I thought that they were going to continue to be strong as the effects of COVID kind of lingered. But I think I underestimated the degree to which, well, I guess I didn't see how much federal stimulus there was going to be in the U.S., but also I underestimated how important that could be. And at the same time, because people weren't traveling as much, they had a lot more discretionary income. So there was just so much fuel, I guess, to drive spending. So 2021 ended up being a much stronger year than I imagined. And in particular, one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of the collapse of the middle, that these unremarkable retailers that are neither great on the value side of the equation or strong on, I guess, what we could call the more experiential side. I really thought that collapse was going to accelerate. So the Macy's, the JC Penneys of the world were going to have much tougher times. And I think, that has not turned out yet to be the case. I still think it's going to be an issue as we move forward, but that's certainly kind of like what's the expression? Kind of kick the can down the road in the case of some of these retailers.
Sucharita, last time you and I saw each other in person, I remember it sometimes I don't remember anything, but this I remember clear as a bell. You and I were sitting in the media room at the last NRF. What was that, 2020? And we were talking about a bunch of things, including the role of marketplaces and the role of these, I guess, what we call digitally native vertical brands that Steve was, later in the book kind of skeptical. And we're now seeing IPOs come out, and we're seeing information come out that kind of lends credence to the challenges that they're facing about what do you call it, Steve? Profitability or profitless sales, profitless growth. Sucharita, do you think it unraveled the way you thought? And was there any surprises let me wrap this long question. There is a question here and somewhere.
We'll find it eventually.
We'll find this question eventually. I'll come to it. If you were to write that intro again, if you're going to write the opening remarks again, would you write them a little differently? What do you think about those kind of two things and the things both we talked about and how you put keys to or fingers to keys last time?
Well, I think that there are different audiences and different types of retail that we're talking about here, right? And I think that the message to some of those larger enterprise brands that Steve was referencing, I don't know that the message is all that different to them. I think that all of the principles in the book still absolutely very much apply. And the point is so well taken about that middle, companies like Sears that, that still continue to hang on. And I think that it is, I don't think, it is absolutely, I will, put a stake in the ground and say it's an inevitability that middle is going to shake out. The question of, when is still TBD. And there, maybe that when is going to happen pretty soon because of inflation, right? Because of inflation and interest rates likely going up as well. So that could be the bigger factor that influences some of those businesses versus, ironically, even the pandemic, because the pandemic gave them a lifeline because of all of that excessive government stimulus support that was out there. The one thing I probably would have done a little bit differently if we had done it in later 2021 as opposed to when we did, which is I would have gone back to the notion of hype more because I felt like 2020 it was a period where kind of people just needed to get their bearings. And then in 2021, we started to hear all of the crazed frenzy around everything from the metaverse to Web3 and cryptocurrencies and, Bitcoin rearing its head again. And it just reminded me of 1999 all over again. And, it's exactly a redux of it, down to the fact that we're now in like Cosmo 2.0, but with Cosmo 1.0 economics, I mean, so it's just, it's just
you're
like,
making,
how many
you're making
times
me laugh.
do we have to learn these lessons?
Get on Google and Google it because it's a cool story.
Can I say Second Life? Can I say Second Life at this juncture as well?
Yes, exactly. It's like Second Life again. I mean, it really Second Life, but without nobody knows how to even get into the metaverse. It's just. It's lunacy. But yet every brand wants to build something for it. And it's like, you don't even know what you're building for.
Yeah. Well, let me follow on one thread of something that you got me thinking about. The impact of the COVID of the last couple of years feels like, and what do you think about this, that it actually prepared retailers, particularly probably more so the bigger retailers, for what comes next? Because it felt like if you could twist or form your organization into more agility, and you probably had a bit of a tailwind in terms of sales, or you were essential, as Steve would say, you came out of it a better operating retailer. What do you think of that thought?
I do think that companies are the companies that have survived are stronger in some ways than they were before. But at the same time, I don't know that they have completely adjusted culturally. And I would have thought that what happened is that some of those really fast decisions that they had to make under the pressure of the pandemic, that culture would have empowered them to believe that, hey, we do have the capability of making decisions quickly. We can very quickly stand up something experimental and see if it works or not, and then get feedback and readjust. And what I am seeing now, though, is the opposite, which is basically a reversion back to 2019. I'm not seeing faster movement. I'm not necessarily seeing, all right, we had this to-do list that was 3 miles long, we're a faster company now, so that list should be much, much shorter now.
Much longer. Or that list should be longer, because I guess we can get a lot more done.
I guess that's the other one. But I don't know. Are they adding more? The things that I see them adding are like, kind of a metaverse, kind of application, like not things that customers are asking for.
Steve, what does remarkable retail look like? Yeah,
go ahead. Can I just add one thing to that? The thing that I'm worried about, which I think is related to what Sucharita is saying, is I almost feel like there's a certain amount of complacency that is starting to set in. When I see things like folks saying, department stores are back, I think that's just crazy. I don't think there's anything. I mean, it's true that department stores' sales performance is better than it was a year ago, right? Which is not a very hard thing to accomplish. But a sector that has lost market share for 20 straight years, what is the evidence that any of these guys are doing anything fundamentally different that is going to allow them to gain back share of wallet and market share? And I don't think, we've joked around that for Macy's, it's Wetzel's Pretzels. That seems like to be the best thing they can come up with, or it's marketplaces, or it's retail media networks, or something like that. Those all may be perfectly fine incremental ideas, but they are not fundamentally changing their competitive position. And so I worry that just because we're seeing kind of, what I believe is going to be sort of this dead cat bounce, hate that sort of violent language, but, can't think of a better term for it, that things will sort of settle down. And then, 2 years from now, it's going to be a crisis again for whatever reason.
Maybe it's a good time to buy another department store retailer. Steve, what does remarkable retail look like in the near or longer term future? I mean, you were on the stage with some great folks at Shop Talk, and they were talking. You asked this really insightful question about, if you walked into the store now versus, even 2019, how would the store look and act and be different? How are you thinking about remarkable retail in the near and longer term?
Well, I don't know that I can give you a highly specific answer. I mean, I guess to me, everything is in flux all the time. That's the nature of modern retail. I think the thing we know for sure is that we're going to continue to see more choice as well as more noise. This whole idea of remarkable is to really be about raising the bar, that even very good is no longer good enough to win. And I think that bar is going to continue to be raised. So I think that's going to play out in different ways for different retailers. But the general advice I've been giving lately, which I don't really talk very much about in the book, is I think we're going to be moving into a world that is less about formats and channels, more brands as platforms. And so if you believe that's the way we're moving, then the kind of typical retail model, I would argue, needs to be reconfigured, bundled, unbundled, or unbundled, rebundled sort of over time, which is why I think that, and I know this has come up a few times, that so much of retail strategy, from what I can see, is this concept of building a faster horse. It's optimizing what we already do instead of stepping back and saying, okay, what might this all look like in 5 or 10 years' time? And whether it's easy to make fun of the metaverse, but I don't know what's going to happen with the metaverse. I certainly think it's not going to be very big in the immediate future, but the boundaries are being exploded. People are able to bring in all sorts of different service offerings underneath the umbrella of their brand. And so I think you just have to really force yourself to think kind of like a blank sheet approach to retail and then work backwards, as opposed to the tendency to kind of keep tweaking what you're already doing and think that, some new project is going to be the thing that's likely to make the difference over the long term.
Sucharita, I was watching a presentation you were on, and you were talking about the incorporation of consumer attitudes and values into the values of the retail brands in terms of as a success factor. And would you assess that at this point to be table stakes? And if so, what are the differentiators that are left to win with? So, for example, we're seeing lots of brands pull out of Russia. Some notably have not, and they may suffer for that. But that's one just latest, milestone or whatever we want to call it around this intersection of norms, values, and attitudes for retailers. So how do you see that on the spectrum of table stakes, and what do you see then as a differentiator to make them remarkable?
Well, yeah, and I think it's Yale Business School that's doing a good job kind of keeping track of every brand that has a presence in Russia or had a presence in Russia and what they're actually doing and grading them. And hopefully consumers will react and investors will based on that information. But in terms of, all right, so if everybody does all of these things that you expect, where are those levers of differentiation? And Steve and I've had have had many conversations about this, and I think this is where remarkable retail is particularly good at. This is kind of identifying what's your thing. What is it that you can bring to your customers uniquely? What is unique about your customers that you can solve? And there's a little bit of homework that needs to be done for every brand. There is journey mapping. There is soul searching. There is really looking at your assets and defining your assets broadly. They could be physical assets, like a factory somewhere. It could be, a patent that you may have. It could be the perception of your brand and whether or not people think that it can flex into other categories or services. Your assets could be your human resources and the team that you have. It could be your location. I mean, there's so many different things that can be an asset, and then kind of looking at that as the way to explore opportunities. The challenge is that there are a lot of retailers that are Me Too, right? And they do things because their competitor offers it, or they're doing things because they feel pressured by investors to offer something. And that isn't always the right reason to do something. You should do something because your shoppers want it, or you think that you can attract a new shopper base from it, but not simply because, you're keeping up with the Joneses.
Well, let's turn our mind to the last question, which I'm going to frame it as advice for the listeners, advice for retailers. 2 starts and 1 stop based on everything we think and think about and reflect on from Remarkable Retail, the book, and what we've learned and what we see ahead of us. Steve, why don't you start us off? 2 starts, 2 things retailers should start doing, 1 thing they should stop doing as we wrap this episode.
I'm going to take maybe a little weird take on this. I think 1 is to just lean into discomfort. I'm going to indulge me for a second. I'm going to read a quote from the opening chapter, or the opening of chapter 19, which is about being more of a radical. And as listeners are listening, they can try to guess who said this. The other thing I would say is that if you feel safe in the area you're working in, you're not working in the right area. Always go a little further into the water than you feel you're capable of being in. Go a little bit out of your depth. And when you don't feel that your feet are quite touching the bottom, you're just about in the right place to do something exciting. That, of course, was noted retail strategist David Bowie, who I often lean on for advice. But I think it's, it's taking more risk. It's, failing better, all those kinds of things people say. I think the other thing that I would say to lean into, if you're not doing it, so would represent a start, is, don't underestimate empathy as a business strategy. I think one of the reasons why it's always been ridiculous that this idea that physical retail is going to go away is because people like to be connected. And I think if you're going to respond to this inherent need of human beings to be connected, then you have to develop a greater capacity for empathy. And I think that can unlock a lot of new business strategies. And then my stop would be just stop talking about channels. I think by now it's just clear that there's this blended, blurred world we live in, and the customer is the channel.
All right, Sucharita, last words to you. 2 starts, 1 stop.
The things that I think that retailers should start doing is they should absolutely start to focus on the things that are disrupting the world, like, for instance, climate change being one, and the other being a new global order. And that has implications for things like supply chain and where you source products. And it may be very painful in the near term, but every company that I think now is manufacturing in the Far East needs to rethink that. And, not to, kind of just get up and throw it all out, because that's not viable or realistic, but diversification and reducing dependency on regions that could be hostile to your home country. So that's, I think, some really important things that I don't see a lot of retailers grappling with. And I don't know if the senior executives and the board is grappling with that. There's a lot of focus on, kind of still a lot of decisions in the weeds when there are big strategic, disruptions that are happening in business and retail overall. In terms of stopping, I think that we're in the midst of another hype cycle with respect to technology companies and Silicon Valley pushing, things, and hoping that there's a network effect that then makes, a small group of investors extremely wealthy, but doesn't necessarily impact the rest of us. And I think it's really, really important to understand that, it's okay to be aware of what's happening, but, you don't need to jump on things like crypto and the metaverse now. Maybe they'll be success, they'll take off and be incredibly embraced in the future. Maybe they won't, but you will see that happening if they do get to be more embraced, and you will have a chance to jump on at a later time. But you don't need to distract yourself with the, kind of that interim period where there's still a lot of shakeout. And it's not it's not necessarily in your interest to spend time and resources on it. It seems to benefit, kind of others more than it seems to benefit the retail industry, to be candid. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, I think it's always, just quickly on that, I think number one, it's always good to follow the money. And I think Sucharita is really pointing to, a lot of times there are interests pushing these stories and narratives ahead that don't necessarily line up with what's in your interest. The other thing I heard, I know, Michael, we talked about this on another episode, but this idea of, thinking big, starting small, and being ready to scale fast. And that, I think, serves us well in a lot of cases in building a culture of experimentation. But, you got to keep your eye on the ball. You can chase a lot of bright, shiny objects and really miss what's going to drive your business, not only, next quarter, but, over the next few years.
Right.
Well, in terms of thinking big, I couldn't have imagined a better guest to help us and you celebrate the second. Sucharita, thank you so much for joining us. I learn something every single time we speak in online or together, and hopefully soon together in person, now that things seem to be opening up a little bit. And I really I'd like to thank you for joining us. And Steve, last words to you.
Well, I want to thank Sucharita as well. I mean, she's been, incredibly generous with her time. It's the second time as a guest on Remarkable Retail and writing the foreword. And I would encourage folks, if they are not paying attention, I don't know why this would be the case, but if they aren't paying attention to what Sucharita is doing, they are really missing out, because there's always just incredibly rich data, but most importantly, the insight and interpretation on top of that data. So thanks so much.
Oh, well, thank you guys. Thank you both so much for having me here and always being open to, having a wonderful conversation and dialogue. I always enjoy spending time with you.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you can catch up with all our great interviews and insights, and new episodes will show up each and every week. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel, and last but not least, tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and co-host of the Conversations of Commerce Next podcast, the Voice of Retail podcast, keynote speaker, and host of the all-new Last Request Barbecue Cooking Show on YouTube. And you can learn even more about me on LinkedIn or emmyleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.